mecánica, claro. Las radios, claro.
Soy italiana, eso es de la OIT. Sí. Pero soy italiana, pero he vivido muchos años en América Latina. So. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the dialogue number 3, which will discuss the changes in the organization of production and work and the challenges and implications of such changes for the ability of labor market institutions to deliver decent work for all workers. Let me introduce myself. I'm Manuela Tomei. I'm the director of the Conditions of Work and Equality Department. We have quite an intensive agenda ahead of us, and I have really the privilege of chairing a panel of very distinguished experts and trade union leaders. So what I suggest is that we continue to use the format that has been used thus far, which consists of questions that I will be asking the different panelists, and expecting relatively, short answers, with a view indeed to stimulate and trigger a discussion. We welcome very thought-provoking interventions. We were invited by Maria Elena to think outside the box and creatively. And I'm sure that this is what will happen. A few words, perhaps from my side before I indeed ask the specific questions to the members of the panel. In order to contextualize a bit, and in order also to refer to some research which has been conducted by the ILO itself in this particular area. So what we have been hearing since yesterday is indeed that the globalization, technological advances, as well as the deregulation of labor markets and a decline also in union density and the coverage collective bargaining has contributed to the transformation in organization of production and work in 3 ways, I would say. The first is that it has contributed to the fragmentation of production, but also contributed to greater interconnectedness among the different businesses through the means of global supply chains. The other trend has been a shifting of manufacturing to developing countries and a rise in services sector across the globe in developing and industrialized countries alike. Another very distinct implication of this transformation has been the blurring of the boundaries between home and work, between dependent work and self-employment, as well as between producer and consumers of digitized information. So what has been the implications of these major transformations from the viewpoint of the regulation of work and the protection of workers? This has resulted in a proliferation of contractual arrangements that indeed depart from the traditional employment relationship. I do not need to elaborate on what the traditional employment relationship is because, this is a very specialized audience. And again, this has occurred in developing and industrialized countries because this is part and parcel of a global model of organizing, engineering, production, and work. And from the viewpoint of also the ILO and also from its normative work, all these processes raise two major concerns. The first one is that non-standard forms of employment, I mean, these contractual arrangements that depart from the traditional employment relationship are usually associated by greater decent work deficits relative to the standard employment. And this is particularly the case for certain forms of non-standard employment. So non-standard employments actually encompass a huge range of different contractual arrangements that are associated with different levels of protections and insecurities. But I think it would be important also to highlight very much the negative implications when there is an abuse of these forms of non-standard employment, also for in terms of long-term investments in innovation, in terms of productivity, in terms also of the ability of enterprises themselves of managing at the micro level such a diverse workforce. So I think it's important to highlight the implications on both workers, the performance and competitiveness of enterprises, and innovation, and therefore also social cohesion for society at large. The second concern, of course, relates to the fact that the employment relationship, the traditional employment relationship, has been very much the basis of labor law and social security laws. And it has also been the basis for the processes of organization of workers. And the erosion of the employment relationship is putting into the question the continued relevance of the ways in which existing labor market institutions operate. So there is a question about, do they continue to be relevant? Yes, no. If not, what should be the changes or adaptations that should be brought about with a view to making them more responsive to the new realities and continue to deliver the fundamental protections that they were meant to and they were created for. There is one additional point I would like to make, which is that in the ILO, in 2015, there was a groundbreaking meeting, which was a meeting of experts on non-standard forms of employment. Why was it groundbreaking? Because after many years, the employers and workers decided to sit down and engage in a more constructive debate and discussion with regard to the non-standard forms of employment. Now, as it has been highlighted yesterday, non-standard forms of employment is not a very happy expression. Because it is not understood, I think, outside the premises of this organization, but it was indeed a political compromise, which was meant to not to demonize non-standard forms of employment, because in some instances they may indeed serve a purpose, but at the same time acknowledging that there are serious challenges associated with it, and that there are growing insecurities in multiple respects that need dedicated attention and different responses. Now, I would like to ask our panelists to indeed perhaps elaborate a little bit more on what are the implications of these changes in the organization of production and work on different dimensions, but at the same time perhaps to try to point to some elements of a possible policy response. And I would like to start by Mark Anner, who is the Associate Professor of the Labor and Employment Relations of the Penn State University in the United States. He has worked quite extensively on pricing policies, on purchasing policy and pricing policy in particular, and on the implications that such policies have for working conditions at the very end of the global supply chain. So the question is which type of purchasing practices should be modified, and in which ways with a view to indeed improving the delivery on decent work at the end of the supply chain. Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Manuel, and thanks for the invitation to be here, Maria Elena, Anna, and all the ACTRAV team. I think this is such an important and timely event. I'm going to answer the question. I have prepared a bit because I'm trying to keep it within the time frame. So what I'd like to do today is actually three things. I want to report on some of my recent field research. I'm actually just coming back from India. I've been doing a lot of research in the last years in Bangladesh and India. Second, I want to talk about some of the broader research findings on purchasing practices and implications for worker rights. And third, to be a little bit provocative, I'm going to suggest 7 rules for achieving a sustainable future of work with dignity. And I'll end on that. So I've been engaging in research on the garment sector since 1988. It was the first time I went into a garment factory. I've been talking to probably thousands of workers now. I've been in probably several hundred factories. And a week ago, Sunday, I continued those conversations talking to Indian garment workers in the Noida cluster outside of Delhi. So I want to tell you a little bit what I found and then extrapolate from some of those stories. The first worker I talked to told me he worked on a piece rate system in a factory, and he was paid around 5 cents, 3 rupees for each task he performed, sewing pockets on trousers. On a good day, he could make 25 to 30 operations per hour. He had no contract and thus no benefits. He had been working like this for 7 years with no indication he would ever get a permanent contract. The second worker I talked to was also contingent, but she was paid a salary of $113 per month, which she told me with emotion in her voice was not enough to cover her most basic living needs. She cut the threads off of garments as part of the finishing work. She said she had been doing this work for 12 years, and she never had an opportunity for advancement, much less to get a permanent contract. The third worker I talked to was a permanent worker. And I should say these 3 workers were all in the same factory. It was about 333, piece rate, contingent, permanent. This worker told me he was in the industry for 23 years. He said he could do any task assigned to him with complete efficiency. And then I asked what he earned, and he told me he was earning the minimum wage. At 23 years of experience, he was still getting the minimum, which meant a net decline in income when you take into consideration inflation. The next question I asked him was, after 23 years, what has changed in the factories he worked in? And he replied without hesitation that the biggest change was that the production quota system shifted from a daily quota to an hourly quota, and intensity had gone up significantly. When I was in India on a prior trip in June, I asked a garment worker in Bangalore the same question. She responded that 5 years ago she needed to do 70 operations per hour. She now needs to do 100 to 110. And if she doesn't complete the task, she is forced to stay over and work off the clock until she makes quota. One worker stated in my survey responses, the targets for her have gotten so intense that work now felt like a form of torture. Through our pilot survey, we learned that 82.5% of workers have been yelled at least once over the past year, most often because they were not meeting these impossibly high production targets. We've learned through research that the prices paid by lean firms to supplier factories have declined by over 20% in the last year, and in some cases by over 40%. We're talking about the shirt that you used to make for $5, you now get $4.95, then you get $4.90, you get $4.80 to make it when they negotiate the lead firms with the supplier factories. There's a recent survey, and I recommend it to everyone, that was put out by In Work, reports globally that in 39% of cases, suppliers said at one point during the prior year they took a production contract that was at below cost for them. They took a loss on the contract in order to keep a relationship with the buyer. They're also cutting back on lead times, the time given to supplier factories to make a garment as part of this fast fashion and speed to market trend. Our research has shown that over the last 5 years, lead times have decreased by 8.82% in Bangladesh. Short production cycles, of course, lead to increased working hours. I've seen workers working on regular hours doing well over 60 hours per week, in some cases 72 hours or more. So with this, and to be a little provocative, let me turn to what I'd like to call 7 rules for a sustainable future of work with dignity. Rule number 1, the standard normal workday is 8 hours. It is unfathomable to me in countries like Bangladesh and India why some people are working over 70 hours a week. Millions more are without work. By enforcing the 8-hour workday rule, for every 2 current jobs, we could create at least 1 new job. Rule number 2, workers get paid at least a living wage for an 8-hour day. Global supply chains generate billions of dollars for their CEOs and their shareholders. I learned yesterday that the Dow Industrial Average is now up 17% for the year. We know one family owner in the garment sector is now worth over $75 billion. Supply chains can afford to pay a living wage. This is not a problem of capacity. At the ILC last year, a new argument, at least for me, emerged on why it is not possible, some argue, to pay a living wage. It was said that calculating a living wage is too complicated and hence there is no consensus on how to do this. I would suggest that if we can now calculate the location of a kilonova that took place over 130 million years ago with mathematical precision, we could add together the 5 numbers needed to calculate a living wage: housing, education, food, healthcare, and so on. The time has come to pay at least the living wage. Rule number 3, yelling at workers to work faster using the same old sewing machines in the same old overcrowded factories is not an acceptable manner in which to increase productivity. An increase in productivity results from innovations and technology that increase output per worker at the same level of exertion. Rule number 4, governance mechanisms must cover the scope of the global economy. If we live in a world in which 80% of trade is through global supply chains, then we need governance mechanisms that cover the entire supply chain. The time has come to fill these governance gaps. Rule number 5, given that supply chains span states, regions, and the globes, we need rules that not only permit unionization, collective bargaining, and collective action at all segments of supply chains, but states and international organizations need to promote these rights. Many foundational laws, including laws in the U.S., recognized originally in the 30s the inherent power imbalance in the work relationship, and thus we need to refer to the promotion of freedom of association rights throughout supply chains. Rule number 6, I've got 2 more. Lead firms must transition from what at times we can call predatory purchasing practices to sustainable purchasing practices. What does this entail? It entails pricing mechanisms that cover the cost of decent work. And this is not only wages, but also the cost of safe buildings. And it also entails the stability of production contracts, a move away from this constant volatility, these ups and downs in production contracts. Rule number 7, the last rule. Governments in the global north, starting with the largest, need to either enact labor, trade, and economic policies that allow for sustainable development in the global south, or they will need to open their borders even more. Most people, I would argue, want to stay in their own countries. to be with extended families and enjoy sustainable and meaningful work. If we want to reduce migration, we need to stop talking about building walls and start talking about progressive trade and other economic policies that allow for the growth of sustainable jobs in the global South. To conclude, let me just say that my main point is that technology is not the problem. What we need is to have clear and enforceable rules so that when new technologies are introduced, everyone benefits. As has been said many times before, the future depends on us. That is, the question of whether automation, digital platforms, robotics will bring humankind greater freedom or merely alter our forms of subordination will indeed be the result of a political process. And if we understand politics as the art of the possible, then we have to conclude that positive change can be achieved. It will depend on our vision, on the relevance of our research, on the boldness of our ideas, and perhaps, more than anything else, our organizational capacity, the strategies we pursue, the allies we establish, and the quality of our engagement when we meet with stakeholders with whom we may have different visions than our own. We have work cut out for us, but we can shape the future of work we want, a sustainable future with dignity at work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I think that this is one of the messages that are emerging since yesterday, that everybody refuses this technological determinism. Technology is not the problem. And also the need indeed for clarity in terms of the rules that apply, who's responsible for enforcement. And also, I think you have very much highlighted the fact that given the existing production models, we need indeed action at different levels by different states, right, throughout the supply chain. And states have also a very important role to play. So I'm just now moving to Graciela in terms of saying, in terms of asking her, what type of, labor regulations or other policies could indeed be conducive to indeed contribute to this clarity and effective delivery of decent work for all workers.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Thank you for the invitation. And to Hilda, the ILO, it's a pleasure for me to be here with my colleagues here in the podium. I'm going to try to answer the question that Manuel has asked. We were talking about standard forms of employment, non-standard forms of employment. We talked about how relative this difference is, particularly considering developing countries where the non-standard form of employment is predominant. So in developing countries, we also have experience about what we've been able to do and what we've stopped doing in relation to this very old phenomenon that now has a new face. In other words, for us, these new forms of crowd work and so on is the informal economy with a new face. But the problem is the same, which is the lack of protection in the face of situations of vulnerability that have persons at work. Just to give a general characterization, which is the problem that affects these people, their vulnerability, their lack of bargaining power, the imbalance in negotiating power, which it's most important that the old element of control, such as an element which does assign responsibility to an employer vis-a-vis a worker. So I think in this discussion, this is where we see to a large degree the proposals that exist as to how to regulate, how to protect. In the first place, I'd like to clarify that there's quite a lot of consensus that we have to protect. This is not in discussion. We have to compensate through rules, regulations, the instabilities and the vulnerabilities on the part of working persons. The problem is how to put this into practice, how to have the capacity to achieve institutional transformations and to transform public policies so that they respond to the diagnosis we make of the problems faced by the workers, including workers in the formal sector of the economy. Since we've been very concerned with what happens with the non-standard forms of work, we also have to recognize that standard forms of work, which is formal, where there is an employer, a responsible employer, they're also experiencing the type of weaknesses, including in developed countries, not just developing ones. Since we all know that there is consensus, and we're talking about non-standard work or dependent work or own account work, outsourcing, that the global supply chains, we're dominated by this type of link. And it's not that it's important because it also shows the way that people have to take political decisions that compensate these vulnerabilities.
Demanda, todo.
Work on demand, part-time work, all this has become more prevalent. They're more present in the developing world, but they're also reaching the developed world, such as temporary work, which was less prevalent in the developed world. In this context, there's a debate which I could sum up in 3 positions. It's been described by the ILO, and many authors agree on this. The first would be to maintain and expand the traditional model to the new forms of employment. In other words, the institutional framework should be extended. It's very important to understand that insecurity in all forms, and the 7 forms of insecurity described by the ILO, all require stronger institutions. It's not a question of institutions disappearing from the work market, but faced with these new forms of work, they need to adapt. This is what the authors suggest. They need to find mechanisms such as an expansion in collective bargaining with a broader, more territorial scope that covers all categories of workers. This would be the second position, to adapt these traditional institutions to new realities. There are positions where they say that there should be a new labor contract. Because there's this new concept of vulnerability. This might need a new labor contracts, therefore. In the digital economy, many jobs are flexible, and perhaps this new model of regulation should be adopted. But all this requires great innovation in the institutions. It's not just a question of making a broader interpretation of the old models, but actually of making new laws. Economic and technological changes, first of all, happen, and then states intervene with new regulations. That's how it normally happens. I think we're in a transition stage at the moment, where we're moving towards the search for these new forms. I think it's going to be a process of adaptation that's more viable, And then, but we're talking about the medium and long term, probably as self-employment becomes dominant, which it isn't yet, statistics show that self-employment has increased, but it hasn't replaced dependent work. So at this point, we're in transition. And I think this is where we need the state. But the problem is, we have to ask ourselves how we got here. How did we get to these changes in a situation where there have been more than 200 years of protection associated with the first industrial revolution? This is the fourth now. And more people are excluded from protection than are covered by it. So we have to look at what states have done, what international organizations have done, the International Monetary Fund, the ILO, or academics. All the debates of the last 40 years about the loss of centrality of work. All this has led to people saying that the only solution is conditional transfers, as in the case of Latin America. And this would be the way to solve poverty, but it actually hasn't happened like that. It hasn't solved poverty because it neglected the role of the market as a tool for social inclusion. So in this context, we must wonder why we got here without resolving all these problems. First of all, there is a consensus that we need social security for all workers, that we need legal protection for all workers, that we need a minimum wage, a decent wage, that we need collective bargaining. But we do need freedom of association. And we have been talking about this for a long time, but haven't got there in many parts of the world. When we talk about social dialogue, which I think is the main ingredient to effect this change, what actors are we talking about? Yes, we have a lot of them in society. But who can speak directly for the workers and negotiate for them? For example, in Latin America, only 3 or 4 countries have trade union organizations, and we're talking about medium-level income countries. So what do we need? The old institutions have to adapt to these new criteria. And perhaps in the medium and long term, we need to go over to a new form of protection, a labor contract that does cover all these vulnerable situations. But when there are responsible employers, who are they? And if there are no such employers, where are the other mechanisms? This is a process of transformation. So I think we have to look for responsible employers in each case and use these mechanisms that already exist. And where there is no identifiable employer, guarantee mechanisms of protection by some other means. Thank you.
Thank you, Graciela. Again, I mean, I think you raised a very important point, which is how over the past decades, I mean, 15 years, etc., there has been a decline in the centrality of work as a means and as a pathway towards inclusion and towards the reduction of inequalities. And therefore, interventions and policies aimed at reducing inequalities have not necessarily been focusing on strengthening labor market institutions and, traditional forms of distribution of the wealth generated. And also you raise quite important issues from the viewpoint of of regulations, right? And saying, well, in some instances we may rely on extending the coverage of existing regulations and institutions to certain work situations. In yet other instances, perhaps there is need for identifying a new legal category that would permit indeed to afford the needed protections to workers in work arrangements that might be in a sort of less clearly situation of subordination. And so I'm now actually moving to Gérard, who has been working extensively on crowd working, on the new forms of production and work, in which work indeed is provided and happens through platforms. And this is generating serious challenges because this is contributing to the dilution of indeed, I mean, who does work, who supplies work, who asks for work. Are we talking of dependent workers? Are we talking of independent contractors? Who's responsible for indeed ensuring, the adequate protections? So is indeed to what extent what Graciela is suggesting in terms of coming up with perhaps a new type of contract for this type of situations might be a relevant response. And the other issue is also who's regulating the platforms, the digital platforms.
Thank you. I'm now collaborating with the Foresight unit of the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels. But before I retired in September, I was the director of a foundation created by trade unions and universities in the French-speaking part of Belgium. And so when I started working on innovation and work 35 years ago, we were told about the third industrial revolution, and now you speak about the fourth. So I am an industrial revolution. And I will continue in French. Donc, en fait,
in actual fact, when we look into the effects of innovation on work and employment, we see that there is not, and there has never been the direct effect of technological innovation on work. Everything we attribute to technology comes, in fact, from a series of mediations, and those include the organization of work and of companies, the power relationship, economic power, but also labor relations, collective labor relations, bargaining in companies and at the branch level. And there's also a process whereby innovation is disseminated, and this is a society process. We said yesterday it's not because a technology exists that it is applied. What does this mean from the point of view of sociological innovation? It means that there's a number of sociological forces and power relationships that mean that technological innovation spreads in an unequal way. And today, we can see, and we've always seen, great inequalities in the spread of technological innovations. There's inequality between sectors, between different regions of the world, between different regions within a country, inequalities between different categories of workers, or between men and women. All this is part of the way innovation spread. So in this short presentation, I'd like to stress in particular 2 points which are connected. The first is that present developments in digital technology and the digital economy change the distribution of tasks among humans and the technology that we've built, because technology doesn't emerge from nowhere. It's the result of an economic and productive activity, and this new distribution can already be observed through polarization of qualifications. For example, on the one hand, you have more and more highly skilled professions or highly qualified professions. And on the other hand, less skilled professions, where the expropriation of workers' knowledge has been taken over by technology, by big data systems, by algorithms, and so on. This polarization means that today some jobs have become very visible in society. For example, knowledge workers, workers in branches of activity that drive the digital economy, and other jobs have become invisible. We do not see the people who clean up Facebook, people who change the comments, clicks you like because they've been paid to like a number of sites, etc. We don't see the workers who deal with all this mountain of electronic waste generated by this economy. We don't see the workers behind e-commerce, because behind e-commerce there are warehouses, transport systems, delivery systems, and so forth. So a number of jobs have become invisible. And once they're invisible, it's much easier for them to escape social policies, government policies, and etc. So one of the risks of discussing the fourth industrial revolution is that we forget about this invisible work. One of the first points I'd like to suggest here as policies that should make this invisible work visible. You talked about a progressive trend towards a watering down or dismantling of the labor relationship. This tendency has two facets. On the one hand, a weakening of the labor relationship. Standards are weakened. And on the other hand, an individualization of the labor relationship. These are two different things. They complement each other. But watering down the standards and individualization are, in fact, the two faces of the same trend. I think the distinction between standard forms of employment and non-standard forms of employment is not really any longer relevant today, because there's a continuous link between the standard and the non-standard form of employment. And here you find independent workers, dependent workers, those under commercial contracts, freelance workers, part-time workers, crowd workers, casual laborers, etc. So this concerns not only the highly skilled jobs, but also less skilled jobs. It doesn't just apply to low-skilled jobs. In ICT, marketing, the press, health sector, you also find a great expansion of this rather grey area between non-standard and standard forms of employment. It covers both people who deliver things to your home, people who do small one-off jobs, etc. I'd like to stress the fact that the weakening of the labor relationship also has impacts on working conditions and on health and safety at work. The labor relationship is the foundation of what has made it possible to make important progress and regulation on safety and health at work. When the labor relationship is weakened and it's based on individual relationships, this leads to great weakening of the whole protection and prevention system and of safety and health at work. I've always been surprised to hear, for example, in discussions on teleworking or distance working, people say, oh, it's wonderful to work in a cafe or in a train, in an airport, whereas enterprises have put a lot of pressure on trade unions to prevent postural problems, etc. Now they're saying that you can work anywhere, anyhow. I think there's a contradiction here. People have forgotten all about safety and health at work when promoting forms of employment that are in this area between standard forms of employment and non-standard forms of employment. And I'd like to conclude by giving you some thoughts inspired by yesterday's discussion about unequal technological development. About 20, 30 years ago, there were a number of development theories that talked about unequal development. And I think we can also characterize technological development today in the digital economy as a form of unequal development. It creates inequalities between branches of industry and all along the value chain. The value chains are segmented. It creates inequality between parts of the world, but inequalities in income. Some people benefit more from the bad things of the technology, and other people get more bad things out of it than good things. For technological progress to equal social progress, we need a social and political system that means that the advantages outweigh the disadvantages, and that the inequalities in the distribution of benefits are handed out. The Luddites of 200 years ago couldn't see the advantages, they only saw the disadvantages. During the growth period in the developed countries from 1945 to 1975, the advantages led to a higher quality of life, and progress in technology was supposed to equal progress in general. One of the challenges is today is to develop a system whereby advantages outweigh the disadvantages.
Thank you very much. And actually, I mean, this idea of the continuum between standard and non-standard is actually quite important. Technological development as a source of inequality, and also the fact that this work through digital platforms is indeed contributing to rendering invisible work, especially work which is characterized by a lower skill endowments, right? So we have indeed such a variety of work arrangements of workers with different also educational and bargaining power, which is indeed making it extremely difficult for trade unions, to indeed mobilize them, find common grounds, overcoming the individualization of relation, the fragmentation, and this fracturation also of identities as worker and as part of a collective group. So what can you tell us about what has been done also in the Philippines by the trade unions in order to be able to overcome this fragmentation?
Thank you, Manuela. Thank you also to ILO ACTRAV for inviting me here. Before I go to what trade unions are doing in addressing these challenges, well, yesterday we had a robust discussion, at least amongst the speakers, that the changes that are taking place in the character of work have been attributed to a series of mutually reinforcing factors. So it's not just technological innovations, but also some economic and political factors. And of course, the impact of these factors on work varies across countries, regions, occupations, sectors, gender, etc. And of course, these factors, particularly technological innovations, as Gerhard discussed earlier, have been altering, and I think will continue to alter, the dimensions of work, the contractual dimension of work, the temporal dimension of work, the spatial dimension of work, and also continuing to alter the gender dimension of work. So these are the work dimensions that will continue to experience changes, I think. Now, there has been a study by the UNDP Human Development Report, for example, in 2015, noted that, knowledge will become increasingly central for production. So that jobs, especially in the services sector, will increasingly require creativity, intelligence, social skills, and the ability to exploit artificial intelligence. And as Gerhard and also the often cited study of Frey and Osborne note, these technological revolution will further polarize the labor market in terms of income, in terms of skills, and of course, the disappearance of jobs, the invisible jobs that Gerhard mentioned earlier. Now, the low-income occupations are those jobs that are often expendable and are thus subjected to what we call the non-standard forms of employment, or outsourced or offshored by the developed countries to the developing countries. This trend will continue, and even knowledge workers will increasingly be subjected to non-standard forms of employment. The rapid advances in information technology, I think, will enable the simultaneous fragmentation and standardization of routine and non-routine production processes, which in turn allows for the further expansion of offshoring and global supply chains. And as global supply chains are becoming longer and more complex, with more and more intermediaries involved, our concept of standard employment, that is full-time, permanent, protected, involving a direct employment relationship, and spatially confined to a single workplace, is being eroded as well. In short, I think global supply chains, with the aid of digitization of work, encourage and accelerate the use of non-standard forms of employment, and simultaneously the development of the so-called new forms of employment. With erosion of standard employment, the employment relationship as we know it, direct, bilateral, and regulated by labor laws, is increasingly fissured as well. And this would have serious implications on trade unions. So what are they doing now? How are trade unions embarking on some transformational initiatives? How do they address these challenges? Well, we have already discussed that non-standard forms of employment break down occupational identities, erode occupational boundaries, and fracture workplaces. And these are the traditional basis of building social solidarity. The expansion of these forms of employment is, of course, contributing to the collapse of institutional forms of representation of workers, particularly trade unions in many parts of the world, including in my region, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. In many countries in Asia, including the Philippines, the expansion of non-standard forms of employment has been accompanied by a decline in union density rates and collective bargaining coverage. Now, what are the trade unions doing? I go now to the question of Manuela. Well, if you look at the union renewal or union revitalization literature, various trade unions all over the world have started expanding their mantle of representation and protection to non-standard workers as a way to reverse membership decline, a way to avert their waning influence and legitimacy in the economic and political spheres, and energize their organization. Now, these strategies have been labeled as union expansion, union field enlarging, and union inclusion. Well, in a recent ILO ACTRAV research project, which I did with some colleagues who are alumni of the Global Labor University, we highlighted what we call the positive transitioning effect of trade unions. That is, the facilitation of transition of workers from precarious, non-standard, and informal employment to what we call protected employment, some elements of decent work in it. Now, these transitioning initiatives were innovatively implemented through the use of various power resources, although, of course, the trade unions did not label them as power resources. So these are institutional power, associational power, structural power, and societal power. This means that trade unions have gone beyond their traditional terrains of engagement and action. And often the strategy is dual. One is representation of workers, non-standard workers in the informal sector, and at the same time also trying to participate and get involved, in regulating the use of non-standard employment, either at the workplace level, at the industry level, or at the national level. Now, similarly, the recently concluded global research project of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung on trade unions in transformation, where myself and Professor Eddie Webster are part of it, we included also case studies that analyzed, again using the power resources approach, successful transformational initiatives undertaken by trade unions in various parts of the world that again involve innovative ways of organizing and protecting non-standard workers, and at the same time trying to curb or arrest the spread of non-standard forms of employment. So this project included, for example, I think 24 case studies. Now, all these suggest that trade unions have already undertaken or are undertaking self-reform, so a way to address these challenges. So these are transformational initiatives that basically embrace a working class orientation. Now, what is needed is for trade unions to embark on similar initiatives, especially that, as Frey and Osborne in their often cited work point out, the distribution of the positive outcomes of technological innovation depends on the balance of power in society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's actually, I like the politics of language, right? It's a standard versus non-standard, shifting towards protected employment. I think that indeed there are a number of insights that are emerging here that should inform future action in terms of also, and reflection, also by the ILO, in terms of how to indeed denominate or refer to this phenomenon, which is extremely dynamic. And also to identify adequate benchmarking in terms of determining and assessing the quality of employment and work arrangements. Melissa was very much referring to this successful transformational initiative by the trade unions, operating in terms of representing and giving voice to workers in unprotected employment, and at the same time trying to somehow counter the expansion and the growth of insecure work arrangements by indeed influencing regulatory processes. So I now turn to our trade union leaders in order indeed to have some their own reflections in terms of how they concretely in their respective also sectors have been addressing these challenges. I mean, is it possible to indeed generate these transformational initiatives? What does it take? What is required, not only by the labor movement, but also in terms of the overall policy-making environment? So I would start by giving the floor to Kiel Jacobsen. Please.
Gracias por la invitación.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak Spanish, hopefully not Portugal. I'd like to mention 4 points here, which I think are important for this discussion. First, if we want to positively face with positive outcomes for the workers this situation, this time of so many challenges and difficulties, we need much greater accumulated strength than what we've had to date. Because what is at stake here, I think this is the hardest time that is in the labor-employer dispute. And although we agree with social dialogue and so on, there's only really dialogue if there are organized, strong actors. And there's no question that this dispute is really very strong. I think Warren, the multimillionaire Warren Buffett, said, yes, there is a class struggle, and my class is winning that struggle. And this is the subject, the theme that we have to look at from a trade union point of view, to have this viewpoint clear. The second is the role of the government. Obviously, we want a government that fairly distributes the benefits that we produce, that the workers and the producers produce. And we are on the weakest link. We always think that the government should seek our protection. The problem is that the state is being privatized and appropriated by the 1%, as was mentioned in the United States in particular, by various mechanisms, which I don't have to mention here, but including international development cooperation is privatized. And it's not for the benefit of those who need it, but it's companies who work with it. Third point, which I'd like to mention and spend a bit more time on, is the role of the trade unions as extremely important social actors. Trade unions, in my view, were right in responding to the first and to the second industrial revolution with a great deal of sacrifice, with a great deal of bravery, courage. The model of trade union organization that we know today was achieved during the second industrial revolution. That is the assembly line of products, vertical manufacturing processes with thousands of workers without any professional skills, but they were able to achieve a model of trade unionism which was more representative and powerful than what was known until then. The problem is that this productive model changed, and the trade unions know. As was just mentioned by Melissa, in other words, we must emphasize, we continue to emphasize and continue to organize according to a model that no longer exists. Yesterday, someone was saying that each new revolution brings with it parts of the previous revolution, but also an important part of innovation. In this case, the third industrial revolution, through global supply chains, has this change. And this change we are not knowing how to respond to on the part by the trade unions. There might be positive experiences here, but there's still a lot to be done for us to consider that we have a new model for effective trade union organization that transcends the national boundaries. That's another characteristic of the trade union organization that we have. Therefore, if we are unable to achieve or unable to face the third industrial revolution, how can we possibly measure up to the fourth, which will not change the decentralized model, the global supply chains? No, it'll add more technology to this model. Therefore, it seems to me that the challenge for the trade union movement is to promote this changed response to this new model. If I ask myself how we do this, well, I don't really have an answer, but I'm certain that we have to do it. That all of us as trade unions, we all have responsibilities, and we really need to think about this, to really reflect on it, to take new initiatives, have experiences as to see what works, and then evaluate how effective we're being. And finally, I think another very important point, that is the asymmetry between countries. We're talking about a fourth industrial revolution, a very highly technological revolution, but there are countries that haven't really reached the first industrial revolution yet. So what perspective do the workers have at that level of country? In other words, what is the plan for those who take decisions in the global supply chain for this whole series of countries with these different characteristics? And it seems to me that we have to take this into account. The trade union perspective has to be taken into account, particularly in the least developed countries. They're only going to be subject to the bad consequences of technological development and not the possible benefits of it. These would be, I think, points in which to begin our discussion, at least from my perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I think these are quite thought-provoking reflections that indeed open the way for a response from both Walter Sanchez and Richard Wagstaff, because indeed, Kild, you have highlighted the disconnect between the current model of production and the model of organizing and projecting themselves of the labor movement, that if there have been some innovative social innovations and transformations, etc., they are quite scattered, are fragmented, that there is also an inadequacy to try to move beyond the local or national sphere and try indeed to extend influence across boundaries and frontiers. So I think that perhaps Walter can indeed provide some elements of a possible response.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. It's of course it's our day-to-day debate and concerns, but just to starting from the perspective of the sectors that we represent, so energy, mining, manufacturing worldwide. First of all, it's important to say that these three megatrends that we're talking here. So elimination of jobs due to gains of productivity, migration of investments and jobs to south and to southeast of the world, and increase of precarious work along the supply chains is nothing new to us. So it didn't start with digitalization. So it's something that is ongoing. But we're facing now is the amazing leap in the way that these trends are getting more deeper and deeper. But if we compare, with these trends, ongoing trends, so we take two examples. So we have one side, let's take India, which is experiencing huge growth rates in the last years, huge foreign investment, but they still experience over 90% of informal workforce. So which is 90% of the population doesn't have either neither an individual contract. We're not saying about collective contract. So out of the remaining 10% of the formal workforce, 40% are what we could call precarious. So this is the growing area of the work for industry. And if we take let's say, another example, so there is no doubt that employment and investment is migrating out of Europe. But if you take Germany, which is a highly innovative country, but it's a country that experiences, of course, full formality of the work market and only 5.7% unemployment. So what's the responses of both countries? It's a combination of issues that make this reality clear. I would say that co-determination system in Germany is one of the key elements because, you put limits on the power of transnational corporations, you discuss industrial policies, so you combine a lot of elements to to keep Germany still as an important production and innovative country. So the thing that I'm not the ones that say that the world of work is going to end, so it's the end of the world. So we're about an apocalypse of our all. So I think what we're seeing is a big reshuffle of sectors and investments and trends. So the thing is, so of course there are lots of sectors, branches, economic branches, which are disappearing, or the ones that are having a different significance, and there are new ones that are being created. So just to give some examples, we just made, in the beginning of this month, we just signed a global framework agreement with a rising fast fashion online retailer, which is ASOS. I don't know if you know. I just got to know 1 month ago about the existence of it, but this is a fast-growing company. They don't have any physical shops, but they're already supplying from a number of countries, and they sell their products online in 50 countries. So it's a company that has about 7 years existence, 17 years since the year 2000. So it's and it's a breakthrough for us because it's the first online retailer that we make a global framework agreement that will discipline, and open doors because it guarantees access for our unions to try to organize and do supply chains. And it's a very crucial, so Mark mentioned about the garment and textile and garment sector, which is one of the growing areas in Asia as well. For example, another example of something that is changing in our sectors, if we think about this small thing here that most of us cannot live without it. So it didn't even change the electronic industry, but all the things that are built around it. So the engineering, so apps, so IT systems. And for example, one small thing that every day we are very pissed off because it's the battery. So, because, that's the limit of our using this thing. The battery increased the production of rare materials to make, so cobalt, zinc, lithium, which are in not very abundant in the world. So very few countries like DRC, Peru, Chile, Canada, Australia, they have some sources of these rare materials. And now there is a new component because, we're seeing the rise of the electric vehicles, which are mostly based in battery electric vehicles. So the source of this, so it's a new moment for mining industry. We're saying that, mining is about to be over. But the problem is that the concentration of the traders, so the big transnational corporations that concentrate this. But on the other hand, it will bring a new moment for a new big production chain. So, of course, within the 14 sectors that we represent, so I would say that mining and energy, oil and gas industry, so all the related fossil fuels industry, they're under threat, of course. But on the other hand, there are other opportunities for other things that are being created. So auto sector is also one that is through major transformation, not only because of these technological trends of electric vehicles, but also the whole concept of the industry. So we're on the same time we're having this change in the people don't want more ownership. There are more and more trends for car sharing systems, and there are also other players coming, so disorganizing the competitiveness tradition. So Google, Tesla, Amazon, Uber, they are going into manufacturing of cars as well. So there's a lot of changes going on. But so trying to go to the what possible responses we're trying to deal with. So last week, one of our biggest affiliate in one of the biggest unions in the world, IG Metall from Germany, they made a proposal for a shortened work week. They have 35 work week contract. They proposed 28 hours work week. So after 20 years, somebody raised their hand and said, look, we have lots of productivity and we have a trend in the the increasing of automation, and that we made possible for us to have more living balance. So of course employers are already shouting out very loud against this. So but for the first time in 20 years we're opening this debate again. We're also working in a number of, I would say, 3 major responses that we are using. One is one example that I used is the global framework agreements, which are important not only for the big transnational corporations, which normally they're not the ones that the major big bad guys, but we can use the leverage with big strong unions in the big transnational corporations to try to organize the the global supply chains. And I will just use an example. For example, we have with H&M. So everybody knows H&M, especially the ones in Europe. They know it's a major retailer of garment, ready-made garment. And in this agreement, we have a provision of national monitoring committees. And we have already in 5 countries, which is a committee where the unions have participation, and they monitoring for example, the access of the unions to organize new workplaces. And we're through these two, we're organizing lots of new unions, new members, which we're growing in Bangladesh, in Turkey, in Cambodia, lots of countries in which we're making some progress. Another thing is some union building projects that we have mostly in Southeast Asia to try, it's a medium long term, to try to create capacity to organize, especially to identify and to organize precarious work along the supply chains. So we're having some good progress in that. And the third one is an initiative that Mark touched upon, which is we call ACT. It's Action, Collaboration, Transformation, which is an initiative together with some major brands of garment and textile to discuss purchasing practices. So, because, I've been to Bangladesh this year, and, I met one employer of a producer of garment, and it was a big plant with 7,000 workers. It was a pretty decent, very well organized plant, and the owner was a very open guy. We have a union there. They have a union office within the plant, and then he showed me one of the ready-made jeans that he produces, and it's paid €7 a piece, ready piece, €7. And the same jeans are sold here in Europe for €49. And we're talking about these workers that, like Mark, workers that gain $70 a month to work up to 70 hours a week. So $7 it's paid. And then, so how can this employer, and there is always a squeeze for less price. So how can this employer pay more if he's always squeezed by the big brands? So let's just remind that Amancio Ortega, the owner of Inditex, is always among the 8 white men, the richest men in the world, and we can explain by this. So the idea of ACT is something that we can combine a process in which we increase organizing and collective bargaining in the ready-made garment industry. Whenever we got this, and the employers in the sector agree with this, so they can ask for an increase in prices in an industry-based system. So it's not a simple thing to do, but it's something that we will start. We're already mapping the situation, and we will start a pilot project. But I would say that the most important answer for us as union movement, because of this reshuffle of sectors, if we stay in our positions, like, one term that I just learned when I got here in Geneva one year ago, jurisdiction. So this is mine, this is yours, you don't touch me, I don't touch you. So if we stay like this, we're going to die at all. We're going to die together. Because, if we keep talking about jurisdiction at national level or at global level, so the sectors are going to mix among themselves. So we cannot, we have to surpass this. And one of the examples that I always give is one of our affiliates, so FNV. So they are a national center, and they used to have branches and local, and they merged into themselves. So FNV is a union. Doesn't matter in Netherlands. So they're a union. Doesn't matter if it's national level, branch level, regional level. So we have to think out of the box. So otherwise, we're going to die altogether. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. I mean, you have raised so many issues, but I think it's interesting, this whole idea about the importance of overcoming jurisdictions, right? And so we move to the last panelist of the first round of questions, and indeed to have, you know, his own views. I mean, this is Richard Wagstaff, president of the New Zealand CTU. Yes, what's your take on this?
Thank you, Chair. I suppose one thing I can do is share with you a bit of experience which confirms these problems spread to the four corners of the earth, given that I'm from one of the corners in New Zealand. We had a very, we thought, very successful recent campaign to improve the work of mostly women in the precarious home support and health industries. And this is the last 2 years. We achieved the eradication of 0 hours contracts in our employment law. We negotiated for 28,000 home support workers, that they no longer be assignment workers, that they actually have guaranteed hours of work and regular work and so on. We negotiated a historic, this doesn't happen all the time, by the way, that's why I'm showing off. We negotiated a $2 billion equal pay deal for 55,000 workers. These are big numbers in a little country. And so we were pretty happy with ourselves, and that has happened. But at the same time we were doing this, we slowly began to recognise that a company had established a new app that put all of these workers in touch directly with people who need home support or disability or aged residential care, in the form of them being contractors. And so instead of this workforce working for providers of disability services or home support, individual consumers could now access these workers through an app and cut out the middleman or middle person and bid each other down. And the huge threat to them is that they're no longer employees. The basis is they're contractors. And so while we achieved enormous gains for that workforce, and we did it by working with those consumers, we insisted that these people need to be treated with dignity, their workforce, and they really supported the idea of valuing the work that was done because it showed value for those people getting the work. They have been quite quickly seduced by the idea of cheap contractors and being able to get the people they want in their homes. And the hard bit for us is that it's not all bad. We can see some real advantages to new forms of work, some of these new arrangements. We have to acknowledge that. But at the same time, it's a disaster for these basic rights of work, freedom of association, the whole lot. And so now what we're trying to do is continue the dialogue with consumers in a very sensitive area. You can imagine with disabled people telling them that they need to think about the rights of other people. It's not an easy conversation. But the idea being that we can't just production needs to be based on fundamental human rights, and we need to support those just as we need to support the consumer's fundamental human rights. And we should all work together to make sure this occurs. And it would seem to me that that's quite a useful place to go with trying to prevent these kinds of arrangements. And indeed, we know about ethical supply chains and so on. I think there's potential real value in that. One of the things that in the regional session of this that I went to in Bangkok was the discussion about this and the conversations about, well, what do we fight and what do we support about what's coming. And one of the things that I observed was that the more developed countries, and I recall Korea and many of the others, Japan and so forth, said that the future of work seemed to be a huge, really growing, strong issue on a political context. It was brought up in elections and so on. But in developing nations who were hearing about insecure work, low-paid work, informal work, it was like, you mean so it's just going to be more of the same? And it didn't have the same level of threat because they've been experiencing those things for a very long time, whereas the more developed nations were pushing back on a bit of a fight. And the issue, of course, is that it's hideously difficult to predict the outcome of information technology, globalisation, demographic changes, climate changes on work. But of course the biggest thing that's hardest to predict is how we respond to that, given that it's a highly political issue. Our response to those challenges, it would seem to us, is the key to determining how the future of work will impact on us. What we have set out to our government, we've proposed that we need a policy response which involves a three-legged stool, so to speak. In other words, three pillars that depend on each other. And they all involve the government getting its act together, which is a big ask in our country where the government hasn't really believed in government. They're neoliberal. But essentially, our view is that and this is confirming many of the themes we've heard, we need a capable state that supports people in between jobs, that supports people in training, supports people in welfare, and so on. We need a state that has an active industry policy that supports industries to develop away from carbon-based industries and to our best opportunities and creates work. And we need an employment relations policy which supports freedom of association and fundamental rights at work. And one of the interesting issues that's arisen in our country off disaster, we had a dreadful mining accident, a coal mine. 29 men died about 5 years ago. And what transpired in the inquiry after that was they all didn't work for one company. It was a system of contractors and subcontractors and sub-subcontractors and a few other bits thrown in. And nobody talked to each other about how to maintain safety in one system. And that's brought about a change in our health and safety law, which attends to saying that there's a sort of a principal owner of an operation that has to take responsibility all the way through the operation. And we think that there are lessons that can be drawn from that because not just in health and safety, but in all aspects of the employment relationship and in terms of maintaining basic standards. So that's some material that we've got and we think is quite useful. One of the other things that our view is that we quite like the basic gap analysis approach. That is, when we think about the future, we like thinking about setting out in 3 steps. Where do we want to get to? Where are we now? And how do we get there from here? And it sounds very basic, but we find that quite practical because you think about actually what are the things we need to do to get there. And when I was in Bangkok, I heard about Singapore, which I thought was very interesting. As I understood it, they've set up 22 tripartite bodies around 22 industries where they do just that. With government strong state support in a tripartite manner, they are establishing where do we want to be in 5 years, where do we want to be in 10 years, where do we want to be in 15 years, we being unions, their members, the employers and the government. Right, let's agree on that. Now let's agree on how we get there from here. And it seems to me that's eminently sensible and practical and something that we should be thinking about in industries and also within government. But in my view, I think where do we want to be, or indeed the very good title of this conference, what do we want, is quite a challenge for unions. Certainly in my experience, we're good at saying what we're against. We're not so good at saying what we want. Or we tend to say that we're against everything that the employer wants. We're sort of taking the dialectic a bit far. Of course we want good pay and conditions. Of course we want good safety and health. Of course we want good security, and we inevitably we want collective bargaining and unions and all of that. But I think while we, of course, don't want to surrender those things, our impression from surveys we do is that potential members and people with no experience of unions, those things don't resonate easily. They don't really believe we can deliver them, and they don't really think, let's quickly join a union to get them. It hasn't, in short, those messages haven't been working that well. And, we wonder whether, if we're thinking about the future of work, we should also think about the fundamental relations of production. We should actually think about the fundamental culture of work, because from our point of view, work is stuck in a very much 20th, maybe even 19th century framework of the master-servant relationship. And, we need to, it seems to us, is present a much more modern and progressive image of ourselves and aspiration for a different kind of work experience, one that is rooted in democracy. And I think Anna said yesterday it starts with freedom. Well, we think it can start we should reconnect with our values of freedom and democracy and freedom of association in the workplace, because many of us think that democracy has got some pretty serious threats at the moment, 1930s mentality and a few other things. And yet democracy at work, freedom of association, in many countries such as mine, aren't really held up as fundamental prerequisites for a democratic society. They're not seen as democracy and freedom of association are really codependent. I don't believe you can have one without the other. But in many of our countries, there is an attempt to have one without the other. And, we think that we need to do some work on the way we present ourselves as a union movement to promote more than just what we used to, but really aspire to new relationships in the workplace where people genuinely are free, where there is a democratic culture, which means people can express themselves, be listened to, have debate, and engage in decision-making in a way that doesn't threaten them and their livelihoods, but actually will deliver a superior form of human organisation. Democratic organisations, countries, companies, families would seem to deliver superior results for humans, not authoritarian organisations. And yet those are the sort of fundamental challenges that I think we need to think about when we present ourselves to the workforce of the future. Thank you.
Well, first of all, congratulations on having been able to eradicate zero-hour contracts in the home-based care services. I mean, because this is could be indeed a model for many other Anglo-Saxon countries that have relied extensively on this type of contracts for publicly paid services are provided. They are completely privatized. So that's actually quite encouraging. And also you raised a very important point of how trade unions can indeed engage in a different narrative, being much more appealing and project a different image of themselves in order to reconnect with democracy and freedom. And now we have really 15 minutes, and I would like to give, to ask some questions very, very, very quickly to all of you, 2 minutes to respond. In the case of Mark, I think that the examples that were given by Industry All are quite promising. And you were referring to the fact that one of the 7 key elements for success is indeed the living wages. So I'm just wondering, you said there is a lot of opposition. So what would indeed, to what extent these global framework agreements could be indeed a venue whereby one can advance living wages and what would be required?
Thank you for that question. I think partly, and just building on what Walter was saying too, it's sort of forcing me to think how we got to this point, which puts us, and I think in a moment of opportunity, to put it like that, and then I'll finish with the living wage. I'll try to do this very quickly. You go back to the 90s, and I look at sort of a critical moment, the WTO in Seattle and what happened there. We ended up with almost 20 years with the dominant model in the garment sector was all the CSR programs, right, voluntary initiatives. And it's starting to turn. And the question is why? And I think there were two key events. One is talked about more than the other, Rana Plaza. And we knew that Rana Plaza was being monitored, and then Rana Plaza happened. And it terrified these lead firms because they knew, I think they knew that these voluntary programs weren't working. But then, everyone was sort of seeing what labels were in Rana Plaza after that building collapsed. The other, which is less talked about, but something I studied, which was what was going on in Vietnam, which is an absolute incredible increase in Wildcat strikes, to the point when we were doing research, we found that 20%, 1 out of 5 garment factories was experiencing a Wildcat strike in a given period of time. What was fascinating about these strikes was that the striking workers realized the leverage these tight lead times gave them. They could pick up when they were being ordered to work more and more hours because a production order had to get off, that they could strike at that moment, sometimes for as little as 2 hours, and achieve some of their demands. And what was interesting about it is through the sourcing squeeze and the contractual relationships, if a factory owner is late in shipping something, there's a fee. It's in the contract. If you're 1 day late, the fee is so much. If you're 2 days late, it's so much. If you're 3 days late, it's even more. And the lead firms did not want to hear about strike problems or anything else. They would tell the factory owners it was your problem to resolve. So it created this fascinating dynamic, and the Wildcat strike started to increase. So you have that dynamic. You've got the issues around Rana Plaza, and the discussion has changed in ways Walter illustrated. And lead firms are coming forward, and they're realizing we've got to do something different. You could see now on there's a report came out of a British group called Fashion Revolution, and they're monitoring companies, and they're listing all the ones that committed to a living wage. And there's a growing group there, and there's a second group that actually have mechanisms to achieve a living wage. And you get some companies, a smaller list like H&M. But I think that the moment is there. The company also that Walter mentioned, at the Regulating Decent Work, they had a representative here and said, in hindsight, with all we spent on CSR, I think we could have taken that money and stood outside a factory gate and handed it out and done more, right? So it means the perception is changing, and there's an opportunity for unions like Industrial to engage. And I think we're getting there with the living wage is becoming more part of the accepted approach for these firms. We just have to sort of close the deal through these kinds of bargaining arrangements, whether it's new forms of global framework agreements or approaches like ACT and industry-wide bargaining. Thank you.
Graciela, another issue which has emerged here is that indeed, in order to deliver decent work, there is a need for the state, right? But the state is very weak. At the same time, public policies matter, make the difference. There has been very little reference to also the role of fiscal policies, right? So could you say in 2 minutes, what?
Manuela, it would be this impossible.
Manuela, that's impossible. I can't do that in 2 minutes. Well, as we've seen here, economic inequality equals political inequality. Could we have the microphone, please, for the interpreters? Thank you. This political effect means that it's difficult to collect taxes from the rich and redistribute the money to the poor. We've seen in our countries that this is a limit on having a universal social policy, which is obviously something you want. particularly when these changes are happening. So the problem of fiscal policy is, and we're seeing this in the USA as well, there was yet another attempt to reduce the taxes at the top, saying that this would have a positive effect, when it's obviously having the opposite effect. So it's obviously a political problem to do with the correlation of forces. It says that this sets a limit on universal policies. I really think that the title of this seminar means that we have to be thinking about the future of the world we want, the future state of the society that we want. And our limits here are political. Everything that is happening now has already happened in the past. It's the triumph of a certain type of capitalism. There are different types of capitalism. There are different types of social and labor arrangements. But now there's a certain amount of convergence. And this is the problem we're facing. We are all in the same boat, but with different consequences. And, of course, the policies of redistribution are extremely different. It all depends on this balance of forces.
How can we make invisible work visible?
I think that to make invisible work visible, we need some cooperation between trade unions and other organizations. In many cases, invisible work was revealed by human rights organizations and so on, or by environmental organizations. And I think that to make invisible work more visible, trade unions must extend, and they already extend their scope beyond the only workplace, the workplace where they are active, the workplace of the workers they are representing. What I mean, but it's not only the issue to make invisible work visible; it's to make the invisible workers visible. How to address these peoples and how to create solidarity among these people. The basis of trade union action is solidarity. And trade unions were built in a historical period where mass employment, big companies and so on, were the most widespread form of work organization, and now new forms of work organizations are emerging, and the construction of solidarity among workers is something that we have to rethink. How to develop, for instance, solidarity among dependent self-employed workers, freelance workers, contingent workers, and so on. And the way of developing solidarity is, for me, one very important aspect. Beyond the fact of making them visible, it's also making them visible together.
Well, I think that you can indeed expand on this particular point, right? I mean, in terms of what indeed it takes in order to create solidarity across such a fragmented workforce and between workers that seem to be pursuing different interests.
Well, is this across borders as well? I think already, like many years ago, trade unions have already embarked on and experimented on what they call coordinated unionism or transnational unionism. And of course, the global union federations and the ITUC have been also involved in these initiatives. And I think in the case of the global supply chains, particularly in the case of, I also do research in Cambodia, the trade union movement, and I see that there is a growing interest of buyers, international buyers, in trying to influence or promote at least the specialty buyers, the reputation-conscious buyers, in order to promote workers' rights and labor standards. And this can be a way, for example, to really coordinate fragmented trade union movements. And secondly, of course, it's not only building solidarity within the trade union movement itself, but in many of the studies that we did, the trade unions have also went beyond their trade union movement boundary in terms of also building solidarity with other workers' organizations, social movements, church-based organizations, like what Eddie mentioned when during his talk yesterday. So here you now have, like extension of the terrain of representation and management. And this is also a way to expand, the concept of work. Work is not just work that is our industrial concept, but work is work also in the informal economy, in the informal sector. So basically, that's what trade unions, based on what we have studied, are doing at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you. Question to all the panel there. All of you have, and all the other speakers have highlighted the importance of fundamental principles on rights at work and how to indeed reiterate and establish and confirm the relevance and the observance of these fundamental principles on rights at work, in particular freedom of association, collective bargaining. So what could the ILO do or should do with a view to indeed contributing to a most effective observance of these principles and rights?
No, I remember when I was still the international secretary of the Brazilian CUT and attending several conferences and meetings here at the ILO, I remember that at a certain moment you started a very strong campaign to abolish child labor. So perhaps it's the case of raising those two issues, freedom of association and collective bargaining, as something to be dealt with universally, as a kind of campaign involving, unions, social organizations, universities, academics, everybody who could contribute to this discussion. Because if we have this as workers, then we are in a much better situation, also in front of the role of the state to face those present problems.
Yeah, that's something that, because I didn't want to give the impression that we're in a rosy scenario in which our global framework agreements make the transnational oblige the suppliers open the doors for the unions and they're welcome and everything is fine. It's not, unfortunately. Yeah? So we're in the uphill battle because there are governments, not only employers, which firmly believe that they can only be competitive as long as they hold the living wage and the non-living wage and the working conditions as low as possible. So the governments, for example, I was in Bangladesh and I discussed with government people and employers, and they said, look, if we raise too much the wages here, we'll lose competition to Myanmar, to Vietnam, to China, to Cambodia. So it's a reality. And what is the next point to make this happen? To crush the unions, to crack down the unions. And that's what's going on. So so ITUC coordinated our efforts among all the Govs in the ILC this year. So we were discussing about 40 countries in which we were bringing issues, because that's the mentality of governments. It's, you know, the way that we will be inserted in the global economy is by keeping working conditions low so that we can be competitive and receive investment, and then we will provide this kind of employment that we're talking about here. So we have to combine all our efforts to fight for trade union rights. So.
I think I know the ILO is doing this, but I think the fundamental principles supporting democracy, especially freedom of association, and the effects of doing that well, you know, as far as I can see, collective bargaining's good for everything by research. It's probably even good for tooth decay. I mean, it's extraordinary what collective bargaining does for economies, for equality, for production, for everything. It seems to me that the ILO could promote the benefits of democracy and freedom of association more strongly with evidence and encouragement for tripartite discussions in nations on how to get there. It's a bit lacking in our country, although I know that our government tends to ignore messages that it doesn't like. But I think for many nations, if a body like the ILO, authoritative, clearly promoting a better way of doing things and being very clear that freedom of association is fundamental to the survival of democracy, I think would be very powerful.
Thank you very much. I think that we could not have a best closing better closing of this panel. We are late, right? Yes. But I would like really to thank all of you. I mean, this has been a very, very rich, insightful panel with plenty of different perspectives, plenty of convergence, and in terms of the analysis, understanding of what is going on, what are the implications. But what I found most interesting is that there have been plenty of elements for a response. So this is indeed what I think I can take away from this panel, and there have been very clear indications also to the ILO itself to see how to move forward. We are indeed in the process also of it's not only the future of work, but I mean we are engaging in a new planning process as of the next biennium. So, I mean, many of the elements that you have highlighted in terms of research, in terms of strategies, in terms of what the different messages should be and what the ILO should be investing in will be definitely taken into account. So I thank you all. I think a big,